Same man just spent 3 months secretly keeping the 2 people his wife wants dead alive in a hidden room beneath the floor everyone walks on every day. That man is Robert Sims. And by the end of this episode, you will not look at him the same way again. For 2.5 seasons, Robert Sims has been the enforcer, the interrogator, the man who drags people to judicial and never blinks. So when Silo Season 3 Episode 5 reveals that he is the reason Bernard is still breathing and the reason Juliette was ever made mayor in the first place, it forces us to ask a question the show has been quietly building toward all season. What actually happens to a person who spends their whole life obeying a machine once they finally see behind the curtain? Let's go back to where Episode 4 left us hanging. Juliette, half out of her mind and running from Camille's kill order, followed a memory she didn't fully understand down into the digger void, into the old tent she used to share with George. And there, impossibly, sitting in the dark, was Bernard. A man the entire silo had mourned. A man Camille herself believed had died in the airlock fire. So the very first thing this episode has to do is answer the question that's been eating at everyone since that cliffhanger. How was he alive? And who kept him that way? The answer starts during the rebellion itself, and the show wisely drops us right back into that chaos to show it to us rather than tell us. Shirley, Knox, Hank, Teddy, and Paul are frantically rigging a pulley system to lower Juliette and Bernard down to medical, without letting the poisoned air from outside bleed into the silo. It's frantic, physical, desperate work, and it sets the emotional temperature for everything that follows. In the present, Juliette asks Bernard the obvious question. How did you convince an entire silo that you were dead? And that's when Robert steps out of the shadows and effectively says, because I made sure of it. To understand why Robert did this, you have to rewind to the exact moment the rebellion ended. The algorithm instructs Robert to leave the vault with his son Anthony and orders Camille to stay behind alone. Robert takes his boy home and waits, gun in hand, with absolutely no idea what's about to happen to his wife. When Camille finally walks through the door safe, his relief is immediate and real. But that relief curdles fast into suspicion. He asks her how much she knew about the algorithm before all this. She admits she knew Bernard answered to something in the vault, but insists she never realized it was an actual sentient program. Then Robert asks the question that will define the rest of his arc. What exactly has it asked you to do? Camille can't tell him. All she reveals is that she's the new head of IT, and that between Juliette and Bernard, one of them has to die, whichever one is more likely to talk. This is where Robert's transformation quietly begins, and it's worth sitting with for a second, because the show doesn't announce it with a big speech. It shows it through a series of small, practical decisions. Robert visits the attending doctor to find out who's closer to death, Juliette or Bernard, and learns that disposing of a body properly, wrapped, carried down through multiple levels, and cremated to avoid contamination is such an enormous logistical hassle that Robert half jokes they should just hope both patients survive. Then, the second the doctor leaves the room, he starts wrapping Bernard in plastic sheeting like he's about to smother him for real. For one genuinely tense beat, it looks like Robert is going to become exactly the executioner his wife's orders demand. And then he doesn't. He leaves Bernard an airway to breathe through inside the body bag, and instead of ending a life, he starts building an elaborate lie to save 2 of them. Why does this moment matter so much? Because right before Robert makes that choice, Bernard, in agonizing pain, tells him about something called the Safeguard Protocol, mentions that Lucas already knows about it, and says Juliette is the one who knows how to stop it. In other words, Robert doesn't spare Bernard out of sentimentality. He spares him because Bernard just handed him a piece of information that reframes everything Robert thought he understood about the silo's true purpose. And once you know something like that, you can't exactly go back to just following orders. From there, Robert becomes something the silo has never had before, a quiet architect working against the very system he used to enforce. He goes to Pike and has him start a whisper campaign to get Juliette named the new mayor, because a mayor is much harder to quietly disappear than a patient in a medical bed. He goes to Martha and Carla and convinces them, against every instinct they have to hate him, to help hide Bernard's body in the digger void, so that Camille and the algorithm believe the threat has already been dealt with. And while Bernard recovers under Martha's care, he starts teaching her something extraordinary, that there are roughly 50 other silos out there, and that everyone has simply been listening to the wrong frequency to reach them. Here's where the episode drops one of its most quietly devastating reveals. Bernard explains that a document called the Order, which sits above the Pact in authority, instructs every IT head and their shadow to keep memory-suppressed subjects away from physical artifacts, anything that could remind them of who they used to be. That's why relics are illegal. Not because of some vague, unexplained rule in the Pact, but because objects from a person's past can literally undo the drugs. Robert realizes in real time that he spent years hunting down relic collectors without ever knowing why the rule existed. He was enforcing a law built entirely to protect a lie. Armed with that knowledge, Robert starts running a plan that is almost breathtaking in how far in advance it was set. He recruits Regina, George's ex, and the silo's longtime relic dealer to slip Juliette's nurse Amy a set of counterfeit memory suppression pills, letting the real ones run their course just long enough to satisfy the algorithm before quietly switching Juliette over to placebos. He has Regina start reacquiring Juliette's confiscated belongings, trading away sheriff badges bearing Juliette's name to fund it, which is exactly why you saw those badges circulating back in the season's first episode. Every strange, seemingly disconnected detail from earlier in the season suddenly clicks into place as one long game Robert has been quietly running under everyone's nose. But here's a question worth sitting with. If Robert had been working toward Juliette's return this entire time, why did he react with such open hostility when she showed up at Anthony's school? That single choice very nearly convinced Juliette he was her enemy, and it's the reason she panicked and fled into the Digger Void in the first place. Robert himself admits, almost sheepishly, that he let the memory suppression run a little too long, overplaying his hand to keep Camille and the algorithm convinced everything was under control. It's a small crack in an otherwise masterful plan, and it's a very human one. Which brings us to the emotional core of the episode, the slow, painstaking process of pulling Juliette's memories back out of the fog. Robert tells her that her recurring vision of Bernard in the airlock isn't a nightmare, it's a real memory. One where Bernard was walking out to die until Juliette told him she knew how to beat the safeguard protocol. The problem is, she still can't remember how. So the group starts handing her physical pieces of her old life, hoping something will finally break through. Childhood toys do nothing. Then Hank hands her the watch her father gave him just before Pete's death, along with Pete's final words, and Juliette is overwhelmed. But the memory she desperately needs still won't surface. It's only when Robert finally produces the Pez dispenser George once gave her that everything comes rushing back at once. Thinking about George unlocks Silo 17, unlocks Jimmy, the boy everyone called Solo, and unlocks the exact thing she'd forgotten, that there's an external pipe the Silo's unseen masters can use to kill everyone inside, and that during Silo 17's own rebellion, they found a way to cap it. Suddenly, Juliette isn't just remembering her trauma. She's remembering the one piece of leverage that might actually save Silo 18. Ask yourself this: if a document like the Order can dictate something as invisible as which objects people are allowed to keep, what else has been quietly engineered into the rules of daily life in the silo without anyone ever questioning why? And if memory itself can be weaponized this precisely, how much of what any of these characters believe about their own past can they actually trust? While all of this unfolds underground, the episode makes time for Carla and Paul, and it turns out to be far more important than it initially looks. Carla learns for the first time that Orla is dead, and she's the one who connects the murder to something much larger. A slow, deliberate theft from critical supply that's been draining the silo of irreplaceable resources like light bulbs, the very things that let them grow food at all. Without a proper accounting of just 2 years worth of critical supplies left, Silo 18 isn't just facing a power struggle over memory and control. It's facing a countdown clock nobody outside this small circle even knows exists. And then, just as Juliette rushes back to warn the Down Deep about the pipe on level 14, the episode does something almost jarring. It cuts all the way back to the pre-apocalyptic past, dropping us into Daniel and Helen's rental minivan as they piece together just how strange the Nimitz's role in the Iran bombing run really was. And then, without warning, the van takes control of itself. Daniel isn't driving anymore. Something else is. Here's the theory worth chewing on. What if that black nanotech-like substance that swallowed Charlotte's aircraft, the one that seems tied to her memory loss, wasn't a side effect at all, but an early test? What if whoever built that technology used Charlotte's crew to see whether it could hijack analog systems, and the amnesia was simply an unplanned bonus? If that's true, then commandeering Daniel and Helen's van isn't some separate mystery, it's the next experiment. And if that same technology eventually evolves into the algorithm running the silos centuries later, then everything we've watched all season, the drugs, the safeguard protocol, the manipulation of memory itself, has one single origin point. So here's where all of this leaves us. Robert Sims spent years being the silo's most feared enforcer, and it took discovering the truth about the very system he served to turn him into its quiet saboteur. Juliette has her memories back, but the fight to stop the safeguard protocol has barely started. And somewhere in the past, the machine that will eventually become the algorithm may have just taken its first real step toward controlling the world above ground too. What do you think really happened to Daniel and Helen's van, and how far back do you think this AI's control actually goes? Drop your theory in the comments. I want to hear it. If this breakdown helped connect the dots for you, do me a favor and hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with a fellow Silo fan who's still catching up. See you in the next one.